On Thanksgiving morning, he found her resting in his barn with a baby. "You're home now." On Thanksgiving morning, snow lay across the land like a white prayer, soft and unbroken, as though the world wished to hide every wound it had ever seen. Caleb Warren stepped out into that quiet brightness, with a lantern in one hand and the weight of another lonely winter pressing down on his ribs. He had grown used to silence over the years, used to the way it settled around his ranch like an old coat that no longer kept out the cold. Yet something in the air felt different, as if the morning itself held its breath for a story waiting to unfold. He followed the faint line of prints bending toward his barn, too light to be a man's, too small to be a stray horse, and his heart tightened with an unease that never belonged to holidays. The barn door groaned as he pushed it open. Warm hay and the faint scent of horses rose up to greet him, but beneath it all was something else, something fragile. His lantern swung forward, and the glow settled on a shape tucked between stacked bales, wrapped in thin cloth and shivering. It took a breath for him to understand what he was seeing, another to step closer. A young Apache woman lay curled on her side, her dark hair dusted with frost, her dress torn at the seams. Against her chest, beneath her cloak, a newborn shifted with a weak whimper, its tiny hand gripping the fabric near her collar, as if afraid the world would steal even that small comfort. Caleb had seen hardship in every corner of the frontier, but nothing struck him harder than the sight of mother and infant seeking shelter in a stranger's barn. He approached slowly, voice low and steady, hoping not to startle her. "Ma'am, you're safe here." The words felt too small, too simple for the moment, but they were all he had. Her eyes opened, dark and sharp despite her exhaustion, and he instinctively lifted his hands in a gesture of peace. She looked ready to flee, even though her body had nothing left to give. When she whispered, her voice trembled like something close to breaking. "Please don't send us away." The plea pierced him deeper than any blade could. He knelt beside her, not too near, letting her feel the decision was her own. Up close he saw the redness around her eyes, the cracked skin of her lips, the way she shielded her baby even in sleep. She had traveled far, too far. No child should have been born in weather like this. "Who hurt you?" Caleb asked, though part of him feared the answer. She looked away, pain tightening her jaw, before she forced herself to speak. Men had chased her for miles, men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. She had run until her strength failed, and the baby arrived early, forcing her into the cold. Shame flickered through her tone, but Caleb heard only courage. She survived. She protected her child. He had known strong people in his life, but none like this. Snow thickened outside, tapping softly on the barn roof. Caleb removed his coat and laid it over her shoulders with the care of a man touching something sacred. She flinched at first, expecting the harshness she'd always been given, but her eyes softened when she felt only warmth. He lit the small stove in the corner, feeding its hungry flames until the barn began to breathe with heat. The baby stirred again, crying, and Caleb warmed a clean cloth in his hands, offering it without a word. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for the trick, the demand, the hidden cost. She found none. "Your name?" he asked gently when she quieted the child against her chest. "Nayeli," she whispered, as though giving him her name meant giving him her last defense. He repeated it softly, letting the sound settle between them. She watched him with a strange mixture of fear and wonder, as if she had never heard her name spoken with respect. He brought her food he had stored in the barn, dried apples, a small piece of bread, and turned away to give her privacy. She ate slowly, every bite laced with gratitude and exhaustion. Her hands shook. He pretended not to notice, wanting her dignity more than her thanks. When she finished, he offered her a small jar of warm milk for the baby. Their fingers brushed, only for a moment, but something passed between them, an unfamiliar warmth neither of them expected. She curled the child closer, whispering words too soft to catch, and Caleb felt an ache rise in him, something he thought long buried. He had lost too much, his fiancée to fever, his parents to a harsh winter, but seeing Nayeli clutch that infant sparked an old truth he hadn't allowed himself to feel. He wanted to protect something again. Someone. She noticed the way he kept glancing toward the barn door, checking for shadows, listening for hoofbeats. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the stove. He hesitated, searching for an answer that didn't feel like a lie. He didn't know why. Or maybe he did. Maybe loneliness recognized loneliness, and his heart understood hers even before he did. Before he could reply, a distant sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats. Real. Heavy. Growing closer. Nayeli's breath tightened, and she clutched her baby so tightly he feared she might crush the tiny body in panic. Caleb blew out the lantern, plunging the barn into shadow except for the dim orange glow of the stove. He stepped between her and the door without thinking, rifle in hand, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. His own fear rose, not for himself, but for the fragile pair behind him. "Stay quiet," he murmured. "I won't let anyone take you." The hoofbeat slowed, then passed, fading into the snow-muted distance. Caleb didn't lower his rifle until silence returned. Nayeli's shoulders sagged with relief she barely dared to feel. Her eyes glistened. For the first time, she seemed to believe him. He set the rifle aside and knelt again, letting the fear fade from his voice. "I'll keep watch," he said simply. She nodded, more comfortable with silence than promises, and eased herself back against the hay. She looked painfully tired, as if she'd spent years running, not days. Caleb pulled more hay around her to soften the ground, careful not to touch her unless she guided the space herself. Through the long remaining hours of the night, he stayed awake by the stove, adding wood whenever the flames grew thin. He watched the rise and fall of her breath, the tiny movements of the sleeping newborn, and felt an unexpected peace settle over him. Protecting them felt natural, as though the world had aligned itself for this single task. He didn't question it. He just remained present, steady and quiet, letting her rest while the storm raged outside. Dawn crept in slowly, softening the barn's edges with pale gold. Caleb finally allowed himself to breathe fully. Nayeli stirred, blinking at the new light, and her first sight was the blanket he must have draped over her while she slept. Her gaze moved from a blanket to him, sitting nearby with the tired posture of a man who had refused to close his eyes all night. Something shifted in her expression, small, tentative, but unmistakable. Trust. Caleb felt it, too, and it startled him. He had spent years alone, building walls so tall he believed no one could ever climb them. Yet here was a woman who had never known him before last night, and somehow she had stepped past those defenses without effort, simply by existing in his quiet barn with a child who breathed like hope. He rose, brushing hay from his coat, and reached for the barn door. Snow glimmered like a field of stars outside. He looked back at her, at the fragile strength she carried even in exhaustion, and something inside him whispered a truth he wasn't ready to face. He didn't want her to leave. The thought frightened him more than the hoofbeats had. It felt impossible, too soon, too powerful. Yet it sat in his chest with the weight of certainty. He stepped outside, letting the cold air clear his mind, but the feeling stayed. Behind him, Nayeli held her baby closer, watching him with a small, uncertain hope of her own, one that neither of them yet understood, but both already felt. And as the morning light spilled through the doorway, something unseen shifted between them, fragile but undeniable, waiting for its moment to bloom. On the morning after, snow fell in a slow, soft drizzle, coating the barn roof and draping the world outside in silence. Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped around the small space, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of dried apples. Nayeli stirred, blinking against the pale light that crept through the cracks in the weathered wood. The baby lay nestled against her chest, breathing in shallow, steady rhythms, and for the first time in days, she felt a quiet sense of safety. She lifted her head slowly and saw Caleb across the barn, tending to the stove with careful attention, his hands skilled and steady despite the chill. He turned when he sensed her gaze, offering a small, tired smile. There was no grand gesture, no heroic claim, just the gentle acknowledgement of presence. "Coffee's warm," he said, his voice rough but soft enough to be comforting. He handed her the tin cup, and her fingers brushed against his as she took it. The contact was fleeting, yet it carried a weight neither of them fully understood. She sipped slowly, letting the warmth seep into her hands and along her throat, and for a moment the past, the running, the fear, the endless cold, slipped from her mind. Caleb moved about the barn quietly, stacking more firewood and ensuring the newborn remained comfortable. His actions spoke more than words ever could, teaching her a language of care without expectation. Nayeli watched him with cautious curiosity, her eyes tracing the lines of his rugged face, the way his coat bore the marks of countless winters, the way his eyes softened whenever they met hers. She realized she had never seen a man so deliberate, so entirely present, and it stirred something unfamiliar in her chest, an unspoken longing for trust, for safety, for a companion who existed without judgment. The morning passed in gentle rhythms. Caleb showed her how to light a small lantern properly, how to wrap the baby in the thick wool shirt he had lent her. Nayeli's hands trembled at first, unsure of their own strength after weeks of exhaustion and fear, but under his calm guidance, she found confidence she had thought lost. With each small success, the silence between them became a language of its own. Laughter was rare and fleeting, but when it came, it left warmth behind, like sunlight sliding across snow. By midday, the snow outside had thickened, and the barn seemed to shrink into a private world of amber glow and soft warmth. Caleb moved closer, kneeling near her as she tended the baby, speaking in a low voice about simple things, the rhythm of winter, the taste of coffee, the quiet solitude of the ranch. Nayeli listened, noting the steadiness in his words, the absence of judgment, the way he made even silence feel full. She began to share fragments of her own past, the loneliness, the fear, the feeling of being sold and unwanted. He listened without interruption, absorbing each word with a weight that conveyed understanding rather than pity. The afternoon light slanted through the cracks, casting golden stripes across the barn floor. Nayeli noticed the way Caleb's hands moved, strong, capable, careful, and it brought her a strange reassurance. She had walked through storms and threats for so long, never letting anyone see her exhaustion, and yet here, in the quiet warmth of the barn, she felt the courage to exhale. She realized, almost with disbelief, that she was beginning to trust him. As evening approached, Caleb sat beside her while she fed the baby, their shoulders brushing occasionally, a subtle reminder of shared space and quiet intimacy. He did not force conversation, nor did she. The silence itself became a comfort. Then, as if drawn by necessity, he reached out and lightly touched her hand, not intrusive, merely affirming presence. She did not pull away. Their fingers lingered together, and in that simple contact, an unspoken promise formed, that they would guard this fragile peace, come what may. Night fell with a hush, and the storm outside pressed against the barn with the soft patter of snow. Nayeli's weariness finally overtook her, and she leaned slightly against Caleb as she settled with the baby. His hand hovered, not pressing, simply there to support. The heat between them was quiet, intimate, and unforced. Words were unnecessary. Their breath, the rhythm of the baby, and the subtle press of hands said all that needed saying. Suddenly, distant hoofbeats cracked the fragile silence, sharp against the drumming of falling snow. Nayeli stiffened instinctively, clutching the child as a protective shield. Caleb moved instinctively, rising to stand between her and the door, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the white blur of the storm outside. The tension was taut but measured. Caleb's calm presence offered more protection than the weapon ever could. "Stay close," he whispered, and she did, feeling the first real sense of security in weeks. The hoofbeats faded eventually, leaving only the soft patter of snow and the warmth of the barn. Caleb lowered his rifle, but did not move from his protective position. Nayeli exhaled slowly, allowing a fragment of relief to enter her chest. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not only strength but the gentleness of someone who had known loss and solitude yet chose care over indifference. By the first gray of dawn, a fragile routine had settled over them. Caleb added a few more logs to the fire, while Nayeli adjusted the baby in her arms. The barn no longer felt merely shelter. It felt like a fragile sanctuary, a space where their presence validated each other's survival. Caleb stepped outside briefly, letting the cold brush his face, clearing his thoughts, while Nayeli watched from the doorway, a blanket drawn around her shoulders. Their eyes met, and in the simple acknowledgement, both recognized the unspoken truth. They had begun to rely on each other, to trust, to hope. When he returned, he knelt beside them, careful to let the baby remain undisturbed. "You don't have to leave," he said softly, almost to himself, unsure if he had the right to say it, yet knowing it needed to be said. Nayeli's gaze met his, and for the first time, she felt the courage to nod. It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, an acceptance of possibility, a fragile step toward connection. Even as the snow continued to fall outside, painting the world in cold silver, the warmth inside the barn grew. Caleb moved to place an extra blanket over them, their shoulders brushing, their shared breaths mingling in the firelight. The baby stirred, stretching tiny limbs, a small sound that filled the space like a blessing. In that quiet, intimate moment, they understood that home was not just a building, but the presence of someone who chooses to stay, who chooses to protect, who chooses to trust. As morning deepened into day, the barn felt suspended in time. Outside, the snow erased the world they knew, leaving only footprints in its wake, while inside, the beginnings of a bond formed. Nayeli and Caleb, each scarred by loss and hardship, found themselves drawn together not by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but by quiet acts of care, mutual respect, and the shared warmth of being seen and understood. And as the storm continued to veil the ranch, they sat together, close but not forced, eyes meeting across the baby's small form. An unspoken understanding passed between them, that despite the threats of the world outside, they had begun to find a place of safety in each other's presence. The snow would continue to fall, the winds would rage, and the world beyond the barn would remain as indifferent as ever. But here, in this fragile sanctuary, they had begun to create something lasting, something tender, and something worth protecting. The barn door rattled gently in the wind, reminding them of the dangers that still lurked beyond the wood and fire. Caleb adjusted the blanket over Nayeli's shoulders, his hand lingering briefly. She looked up at him, the weight of unspoken words heavy yet comforting. Neither needed to speak. The understanding passed through touch, through the warmth of the fire, through the steady rhythm of the baby's breath. It was enough. And in that quiet, suspended moment, a truth settled into both their hearts. The world may be harsh, unforgiving, and full of threats, but within the walls of that barn, two weary souls had begun to find home, not in stone or timber, but in the trust and care they offered each other. The chapter of fear and flight had softened, and the beginning of something enduring, a fragile, tender bond, had taken root. As the snow continued to fall, they remained together, the baby between them, a small symbol of hope and new beginnings. And though the storm still raged beyond the barn, neither dared look away. They had found, at last, a warmth that could weather even the coldest of winters.